All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to PHRC's Fair Housing and Power Hour series. Today, we will be discussing accessibility and fair housing. My name is Brittany Millinger. I am the Director of Fair Housing and Commercial Property at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and I'll be your presenter today. Before we get started, I wanted to draw your attention to a notice in the chat, and this is about the Wiretap Act. So it's against the law in Pennsylvania to record oral conversations without the permission of the folks involved in most circumstances. And I do want to let you know that this session is being recorded for training and record keeping purposes. By participating in this session, you are consenting to the recording, retention, and use of this session. At any time, if you have a question or a comment, please feel free to put that in the chat and we will respond to you as soon as possible. If you would like to ask your question or to comment verbally, please note that by doing so, you are consenting to the recording, retention, and use of your statements recorded as part of this session. If you have any questions, please let us know. And I also want to let you know that we will be sharing out this recording at the end of the session today, and we will also share out the slides and materials that are presented today as well. So you will have access to that after this session. So about this series in general, the Fair Housing and Power Hour series was created to provide practical, actionable housing information to a wide range of housing audiences. So our housing providers, realtors, lenders, social service providers, community members, governmental partners, and more. So we all have a role to play in ensuring fair housing. Today, we will not be doing a really deep dive into the more technical aspects of accessibility. Our aim today is to provide a broad overview and then share links with additional details for you to do more in-depth learning on your own if you would like to do so. But we always emphasize that everyone has the right to fair housing in Pennsylvania. We believe very strongly in our fair housing laws and making sure that everyone has equal access and opportunity to housing. And accessibility is a very significant part of that. Our training goals today include providing an overview of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, identifying relevant fair housing laws, as well as other laws that require accessibility, reviewing the types of buildings and dwellings that are covered, discussing types of disabilities, discussing fair housing accessibility requirements, and of course, the most important thing is answering your fair housing questions. So at any point in the presentation, if you have a question or a comment to share, please feel free to do so by putting that in the chat or raising your hand if you would like to request to be unmuted to share a verbal comment. And one last notice is our engagement acknowledgement. So information, materials, and or technical assistance are intended solely as informal guidance and are neither a determination of your legal rights or responsibilities under the PHRA and or applicable federal laws, nor binding on any agency with enforcement responsibility under those same laws. I'm providing information, not legal guidance today. For those of you who are not familiar with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, we are the state's leading civil rights enforcement agency. We've been around since 1955, so we are celebrating 70 years today, and we have a two-part mission. We work to enforce Pennsylvania's non-discrimination laws, which include both the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act as well as the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. And we also work to promote equal opportunity for all in Pennsylvania. So we accept complaints when people believe they've experienced discrimination in any of the areas that we cover. But we also work to proactively make sure that this information is getting out into communities. So through trainings and programs like this one, through events and conferences, and through our advisory councils and social justice ambassadors throughout the state. We do cover the entire state of Pennsylvania, and we do that through 3 regional offices. So in the western part of the state, we do have a regional office in Pittsburgh. In the central part of the state, we have a regional office that's located in Harrisburg. And in the eastern part of the state, we have a regional office that is located in Philadelphia. These regional offices do a tremendous amount of the work of the Commission in accepting and investigating complaints. Our focus is going to be housing today, but I don't want to have you leave the session without an awareness of the rest of the work of the Commission. So we also do work in the spaces of employment and commercial property, as well as public accommodations, so the access to public businesses and services, as well as primary and secondary education up through high school. All of this is covered under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. And then post-secondary education, such as colleges and trade schools, technical schools, those are covered under the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act as well. If you would like further information on the other work of the PHRC, we've got a lot of tremendous information on our website, and we also have separate trainings on all of those aspects as well. So let's start out with our fair housing laws. I always like to begin this discussion by just providing a brief overview of fair housing goals, what our fair housing laws are seeking to accomplish, since I think that sets helpful context. So the first goal, ending housing discrimination, making sure that no one is kept out of housing opportunities because of aspects of their identity, their protected class. But goal number 2 goes further than that, promoting diverse, inclusive communities. And in the fair housing world, we call that affirmatively furthering fair housing. So that's part of the Fair Housing Act. And there's been a lot of discussion around that, around what that means and how that's enforced. But I think the heart of affirmatively furthering fair housing is that for a long time, we've had laws and practices and policies that have limited housing opportunities for groups of Pennsylvanians, as well as other individuals throughout the United States. And because of that, we see some really deep housing inequalities and limitations in who can access the housing that we all need to live healthy, successful lives. So there's a lot of work that we all need to do to make sure that we're able to live up to the promise and the goals of fair housing. I want to move on to our discussion around federal laws and regulations. So we're going to start off with the Architectural Barriers Act, passed in 1968. So this was the first measure by Congress to ensure that the built environment for people with disabilities met their needs, and it included it as specifications for ramps, parking, doors, elevators, restrooms, assistive listening systems, fire alarms, signs, and other elements. And it stipulates that all buildings other than privately owned residential facilities that are constructed by or on behalf of or leased by the United States, or buildings that are financed in whole or by part by the United States, they must be physically accessible for people with disabilities. And the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards is the applicable standard under this act. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act was passed in 1973. And under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, as amended, no otherwise qualified individual with a disability may be discriminated against in any program or activity that's receiving federal financial assistance. The purpose of Section 504 is to eliminate discriminatory behavior toward people with disabilities and to provide physical accessibility, thus ensuring that people with disabilities will have the same opportunities in federally funded programs as do people without disabilities, so ensuring that equal access and opportunity. So Section 504 initially addressed the built environment and reasonable accommodations, but more recently there was a final rule that was passed that also ensured digital accessibility, which is really key when we think about accessing information about housing opportunities, since so much of that happens in the digital space these days. Next, I want to briefly discuss the Fair Housing Act of 1968 as amended. So if you have attended other Fair Housing and Power Hour sessions in the past, this law should be very familiar to you. So the Fair Housing Act provides equal opportunities for people in the housing market, regardless of their disability, race, color, sex, religion, familial status, or national origin, regardless of whether the housing is publicly funded or not. And this includes the sale, rental, or financing of housing, as well as the physical design of newly constructed multifamily housing. So this has very broad coverage. Initially, the Fair Housing Act only covered the protected classes of race, color, religion, and national origin, but it was later amended to cover sex, familial status, and disability as well. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 1990, is a broad civil rights law that guarantees equal opportunity for individuals with disabilities in employment, public accommodations, transportation, state and local government services, and telecommunications. And Title III of this act covers all private establishments and facilities that are considered public accommodations, such as restaurants, hotels, retail establishments, doctors' offices, and theaters. So some folks might be thinking, well, why are you covering this under housing if this is public accommodations? And the reality is that ADA also covers certain areas of a housing complex that would be open to the public, such as a leasing office or other spaces. So it's important to note those protections as well. And lastly, I want to discuss the ADA Amendment Act of 2008. And this amended the ADA, and the definition of disability in this act shall be construed in favor of broad coverage of individuals in this act to the maximum extent permitted by the terms of this act. And it states that the term substantially limits shall be interpreted consistently with the findings and purposes of the ADA Amendments Act of 2008, and an impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity need not limit other major life activities in order to be considered a disability. And an impairment that is episodic or in remission is a disability if it would substantially limit a major life activity when active. So it really clarifies what a disability is and is more expansive in looking at episodic disabilities, those who are in remission, or those that might only impact a certain aspect of someone's daily life. We're going to move on to a discussion around buildings and dwellings that are covered under the Fair Housing Act. So the Fair Housing Act covers most types of housing. In some circumstances, it does exempt owner-occupied buildings with no more than 4 units, single-family housing that's sold or rented without the use of a broker, as well as housing that's operated by organizations and private clubs that limit occupancy to members. I want to note that the design and construction requirements of the Fair Housing Act and the guidelines only apply to new construction of housing that was built for first occupancy after March 13, 1991. So I want you to keep that date in mind because that's the first criteria that we'll look at to see if housing is covered by these standards. So certain buildings that are built for first occupancy after March 13, 1991 would fall under the definition of covered multifamily dwellings. And to be covered, it needs to be a dwelling that's in a building that contains 4 or more dwelling units, if such buildings have 1 or more elevators. It would also be covered if all the ground floor dwelling units in other buildings contain 4 or more units. Now, in the guidelines, there's language around both adaptable dwelling units and certain features of accessible design. So accessible elements and spaces are those whose design allows them to be used by the greatest number of users without being modified. So for example, the requirement within the covered dwelling unit for usable doors, which we'll be discussing in a minute, ensures that the dwelling unit doors are not too narrow or impassable for other residents. We'll also be talking about adaptable and adjustable units and elements and spaces. And those are elements with a design that allows them to be adapted or adjusted to accommodate the needs of different people. And so the Fair Housing Act incorporates both adaptable and adjustable concepts when we're looking at bathroom walls by requiring that they contain reinforced areas that would allow for a later installation of grab bars without major structural work on the walls. I want to touch on the types of buildings and dwellings covered, because not all of them might fall within what you might immediately think of in terms of dwellings that might be covered. So it's anywhere from condominiums and apartments to single story townhomes, vacation or timeshare units, college dormitories, apartment housing that's in private universities, to sleeping accommodations that are intended for occupancy as a residence in a shelter or transitional housing, as well as continuing care facilities or retirement homes. Next, I'd like to discuss some of the types of disabilities and how that might impact accessibility needs. So when we're looking at individuals that have a mobile disability, that might include folks who use a wheelchair or those who use other mobility aids. And a key facet of access for those individuals would be minimum clear floor space that's required. So that way they can navigate the space as well as the minimum turning space. We also look at ambulatory mobility disability. So looking at the space that would be required for someone that's using crutches or a walker to be able to navigate a space. A visual disability that may require an individual to have a service animal, which would mean they would need more space to navigate a space as well. Individuals with a hearing disability, they often use a combination of speech reading and hearing aids, which can amplify the available sounds. So that can cause echo, reverberation, and extraneous background noise that has the potential for distorting hearing aid transmission. And I also want to highlight cognitive disabilities and other conditions. And people with cognitive and learning disabilities may have difficulty using facilities, particularly where the signage system is unclear or is complicated. In addition to people with permanent disabilities, there may be others that have a temporary condition, which can impact or affect their usual abilities. I also would like to share some statistics. So according to the Disability and Health Data System, there are a lot of Pennsylvanians that have a disability. So 27.7% of Pennsylvanians have a disability, which works out to almost 3 million individuals. For those that have cognitive disability, that's 13.8% of the population. 11.1% have a mobility disability. 8.8 have an independent living disability. 6.2 have a hearing disability. 5.1 have a vision disability, and then 4.2% of the population have a self-care disability. So when you add up all those percentages, I think it's pretty clear that some individuals have multiple types of disabilities. So I share these stats just to let you know that this does impact so many of our family members, our neighbors, and other members of our community. And I think that's important to note in this discussion. All right, we are going to move on to discuss the 7 design requirements that are required by the Fair Housing Act in all of the covered dwellings that we've covered so far in the presentation. And the first one is an accessible building entrance on an accessible an accessible route. And covered multifamily dwellings must have at least one building entrance on an accessible route unless it's impractical to do so because of terrain or unusual characteristics of the site. So I'm not sure if you can see in the small text, but the graphic is showing that there's an accessible route to the entrance. You've got your signage in the parking lot with that international sign of accessibility to make sure to designate the spots for individuals with disabilities. There's also a curb ramp that's installed outside the access aisle area and level access aisle. So that way individuals who are using a wheelchair or a walker or some other mobility device are able to easily navigate the space. But when we're looking at this accessible building entrance on the accessible route, it's not just the parking lots. You can see on this graphic here, uh, uh, someone might be entering from multiple spaces. So you can see that there's a bus stop here, an accessible route entering the building there, also from the parking lot. Maybe someone's getting dropped off at a loading zone. And you can see that the spaces going through the front doors into the public spaces and other areas where someone might need to navigate a route that they might need to travel. The second design requirement is a usable door. So all doors that are designed to allow passage into and within all premises must be sufficiently wide to allow passage by persons in wheelchair. So our accessible doors in public and common use spaces and the entrance to units have stricter standards. So it's 32 inches minimum clear width, but there's also additional requirements around the type of hardware that's used, the opening force that would be needed to open the door, as well as maneuvering clearances. So these are more stringent because you've got more people that are entering and navigating the spaces. There's also a requirement for usable doors within the interior of the dwelling unit. So you've got your 32 inches, again, nominal clear width, as well as a low or non-existent clearance. And this usability standard would allow for later modification to an individual's needs. And these doors are important not just for individuals who use wheelchairs, but also those who use walkers and crutches, even for individuals without a disability that might be pushing a stroller or carrying something through a door. These accessibility standards really benefit us all. So the accessible unit route into and through the covered dwelling unit. There must be an accessible route that goes into and through the dwelling units themselves, not just into the main building, that would provide access for people with disabilities throughout the unit. So that includes an accessible route through the common areas, elevators, hallways, doorways, things like that. And you can see the graphic of through the dwelling unit, the various spaces where someone might need to get to. This accessible route does need to be sufficiently wide, and it also needs to be lacking in abrupt changes in level. So that way, someone who's using a wheelchair or another mobility device is able to navigate clearly through the unit and through the space. The next design requirement that I want to highlight is around light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, and other environmental controls. So all of the premises within the dwelling units must contain light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, and other environmental controls in accessible locations. So these specifications for accessible controls and operating mechanisms require a clear floor space to allow an approach by a person using a wheelchair, specifying the height of the operable portion of the control, and they need to require little or no force to be exerted to operate the control. So these guidelines don't require that controls be fully accessible, but they do specify that light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, and other environmental controls that are used and operated on a frequent basis in the daily use of a dwelling unit, they need to be in accessible locations. So you don't have to have every single outlet in this space, but the ones that are in regular use do need to be accessible for an individual who would be in a wheelchair or needing other accessibility devices. All right, next up, I want to discuss the design requirement of reinforced walls for grab bars. So all premises within a dwelling unit must contain reinforcements in the bathroom walls to allow for later installation of grab bars around the toilet, the tub, the shower stall, and shower seats where such facilities are provided. So the guidelines do specify that reinforcing at least 6 inches wide and 24 inches long, capable of supporting grab bars, be provided behind and beside the toilet. So this really sets an individual up for later success to be able to install those grab bars if they would need them without needing to make major structural changes to the bathroom to accommodate their disability-related needs. The last design requirement that I want to discuss is usable kitchens and bathrooms. So dwelling units must contain usable kitchens and bathrooms such that an individual who uses a wheelchair can maneuver about the space. So the guidelines specify that a 30-inch by 48-inch clear floor space be provided at each kitchen appliance or fixture, and that each of these clear floor spaces adjoin the accessible route that must pass into and through the kitchen. And these clear floor spaces can overlap when those appliances are located near each other. The minimum clearance between counters, there's a minimum of 40 inches between all opposing base cabinets, those lower cabinets in a kitchen, as well as appliances and walls. And the design requirements do include additional specifications in a U-shaped kitchen since that's unique. When looking at the bathroom specifications under this requirement, that's an accessible route to and through the bathroom with a nominal 32-inch clear door opening, as well as having the switches, outlets, and controls in accessible locations, as well as the reinforced walls to allow later installation of grab bars and appropriate maneuvering space to permit an individual with a mobility aid to enter the room. I want to take a brief focus on housing specifically in Pennsylvania, because it's important to note in the context of this discussion that Pennsylvania has older housing stock than many other states and areas in our country. So according to data from the 2023 American Community Study, 75.8% of Pennsylvania housing was built prior to 1990. So that's over 3/4 of our housing was built before these standards came into place. That's in contrast to 60.7% of US housing built prior to 1900. That should say prior to 1990. So a greater proportion of Pennsylvania housing stock is older and would not be subject to these same design and construction standards. Additionally, with older housing, there can be more habitability issues if the maintenance and repairs are not kept up with on a regular basis. And I also want to note that Pennsylvania has some variation in our geography. Our attendees in the Pittsburgh region can attest to the hills in the area and a lot of stairs, and that can cause additional accessibility needs to be able to navigate that space and that geographic conditions safely. So I say this to note that there may be need for reasonable modifications and accommodations in order to make housing accessible for individuals with disabilities. And we have whole other trainings on reasonable accommodations and modifications that go into a lot more detail, but I do want to touch on it briefly today, since it is really germane to accessibility needs. So reasonable accommodations, that's a provision which allow an individual with a disability to request a change or an adjustment to rules, policies, practices, and services when necessary to allow a resident with disability equal opportunity to use the property and its amenities. So I'd like to invite our attendees today to take a second to open up their chat box and put in some examples of reasonable accommodations that might be needed in housing in order to allow an individual with disability access to a property or to a housing opportunity. Does anyone have any examples of reasonable accommodations? An ESA, an emotional support animal. Absolutely, that's a great example. Accessible ramps. Yes, absolutely. That goes more to reasonable modifications. Ramps again. Yeah, absolutely. And while folks are putting additional thoughts and ideas into the chat, I'll read our example of reasonable modifications as well. So that's a provision that makes it unlawful to refuse to permit residents with disabilities to make a structural change to either their dwelling unit or the public or common use areas at the resident's cost to allow equal opportunity to use the property and its amenities. So we've got the example of ESAs for reasonable accommodations, and then the examples of ramps for reasonable modifications. Are there any additional examples that folks would like to provide? So some additional examples of accommodations that I often see and hear about include the ability to designate reserved parking for an individual that might need it reserved for them because of their specific mobility needs. It could be a change in the date that rent is due based on someone's disability-related needs. Yep, the rental payments, absolutely. I see in the chat we've got elevators. That would be a structural change to the premises. Handles, yes, those grab bars, whether that's in the bathrooms or other spaces throughout the unit to allow someone the ability to have that additional support. Could be shower bars in the bathroom. Absolutely. These are lots of great examples. And sometimes these need for changes, they go beyond just the housing provider. Sometimes it can be the local government that needs to consider a change to allow someone access to housing. So, for example, it might be looking at the zoning. So, say there's a group home for individuals with disabilities, but you've got single-family zoning and prohibitions on greater than a certain number of individuals sharing a home. Because this group home is needed for individuals with disabilities, they can request that reasonable accommodation, that change to policy to allow for an exception to the zoning to allow this home to be built. So the zoning ordinance is absolutely automatic doors as an accessibility feature. So thank you so much for contributing to the discussion and for sharing these ideas and examples. So for our housing providers on the call, what can a housing provider require? Well, they can require that the modification, if it is a physical modification that's being requested, that it's made by a professional and in accordance with applicable building codes. They can also condition permission on the resident agreeing to restore the modification to its original condition when the resident vacates the unit. So they say this is a feature that might not be used by a broad range of prospective tenants. After the current tenant leaves, the housing provider can say, you know what, you really need to restore this back at the end. Say they lowered the countertops. That can be restored back at the end. But a housing provider doesn't need to require that. They can say it's grab bars in the bathroom. That can be a feature that's really helpful for a wide variety of prospective tenants, and they may not want to condition that permission to the restoration. I also see a comment in the chat that education and awareness like this are also helpful. And I absolutely agree. A lot of folks are not fully aware of their rights and responsibilities in this area. And PHRC does receive a lot of disability-related complaints. So that's why we try to be proactive in offering this education and this information to make sure that everyone is able to fully navigate these rights and responsibilities well. All right. And in terms of paying for the modification, a housing provider who's receiving federal funds is required to pay for and provide the structural modification unless it amounts to an undue financial and administrative burden or a fundamental alteration of the program. So if this is federally assisted property, then it's the housing provider's responsibility to make this modification if it's reasonable. If a housing provider does not receive federal funds, um, they they may need to pay for the modification, but they may not need to pay for the modification, but they still do have the responsibility to permit the tenant to make the modification at their own expense. So they still need to grant it if it's reasonable, but it would be the tenant's responsibility to pay for that expense. And there are a number of programs and resources that are available to fund assistive technology and modifications to allow individuals with disabilities to make these payments and to get these changes that are needed for them to use and enjoy their property. And one last comment that I want to make on reasonable modifications is the need for housing providers to engage in the interactive process. So on this slide, it does note that if it's an undue financial and administrative burden or a fundamental change to the program and the way that this housing provider operates, that's not the end of the story. It's then the housing provider's responsibility to engage in conversation with the tenant to see if there is a way that they can meet this tenant's disability-related needs. Even if that housing provider can't grant that initial request, or if it's unreasonable, they still need to engage in conversation to see how they can accommodate. There are a number of accessibility cases that you can find. There's a number of them on the Department of Justice's website that provide a lot of information on cases, particularly looking at the Design Act and construction and pattern and practice from all across the country. So you'll see there's a couple on the slide here. Several, there's one in Colorado, a few in Maryland, as well as in New York regarding cases where they were these accessibility issues were investigated, and they found that that housing providers had not complied with their responsibilities. So I encourage you to check more information about that as well. But how do we address these accessibility issues when they're discovered? What do you do if you believe that your housing provider may not be in compliance with these requirements? If this is a coverage dwelling that's covered by the design and accessibility requirements, please contact one of our regional offices. You can file a fair housing complaint. You can also file a complaint if you believe that that a housing provider has failed to grant a reasonable accommodation or modification. And our team can assess if this is a violation of our state law. So if this is a violation of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, so please contact one of our regional offices. You can also call our main phone number. You can email us. You can go on our website. There's lots of different ways that you can contact us and get the complaint process started. So I do want to note that it's a free process. You will not be asked to pay any money. And I do want to note that we do also provide translation services upon request, and we never ask anyone about their immigration status. I also note that we have a lot of broad fair housing resources. We want to make sure that tenants and community members fully understand their rights and that housing providers understand their responsibilities. So I want to highlight that the Pennsylvania Fair Housing Line, which is 855-866-5718. This is a free resource for anyone to call if you're looking for further information and resources on fair housing. We've got trained staff that are able to answer the phone and direct you to the right information. We also offer free housing training programs that can be customized to your team's needs. And you can find more information at the link here. And I do see the comment in the chat. Will you be able to share this resource at the end of the meeting? And we will absolutely be sharing out all of this information. We do have our monthly housing webinar, the Fair Housing and Power Hour series, which this is currently a part of. So we'll be releasing our 2026 schedule very shortly. So you can keep an eye on our website for that. We offer brochures and fact sheets both for community members and housing providers as well. We also offer, you can check out our archive of episodes of PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing Forward. So this is a show that we offered on PCN TV, and it was a great dive into a lot of topics that impact fair housing opportunities. Lastly, we have a white paper. It's called The State of Fair Housing in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So we initially released it in 2023, and shortly we'll be releasing an updated version as well. It really explores a lot of the barriers that impact access and opportunity to housing, and PHRC's recommendations for addressing them. And the last thing I want to leave you with is my contact information and PHRC's as well. So you'll see there is a QR code on the screen. So please feel free to take a look at that, and you can access a survey, or you can provide some feedback on that, on the training today, on what you found helpful, on what you'd like to see in future trainings. You can also access a training certificate as well. I see a question in the chat: where can we find PHRC Speaks? And thank you, Director Brothman, for putting the link to our YouTube channel on there. That's very helpful. And I want to highlight that we do have some great upcoming events as well. In January, we have our social justice lecture series, Understanding Latino Anti-Blackness Through the Lens of Equality Law. So that will be happening on Wednesday, January 7th from 1 to 2. We also have a lunch and learn on navigating multi-generational workplace. And that will be happening on Thursday, January 15th from 12 to 1 p.m. So at this time, we have about 15 minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions around accessibility or any general fair housing questions, I'm happy to stick around and answer them for you.